It's indeed time for the world this week. 7 days for Paris-based correspondents. 1 hour, the world this week, in partnership with the International Herald Tribune. And this week, we're pleased to welcome Sylvie Kaufmann of French broadsheet newspaper Le Monde, Christopher Dickey of Newsweek and the Daily Beast. With us, actually, I say for Paris-based correspondents, but Tunde Fatunde has just jumped off the plane from Lagos. He columnist for the Guardian newspaper there. Thanks for being with us. And Dana Harman, Europe editor for Haaretz, the Israeli daily newspaper. The world this week where you can help shape the discussion throughout the week on our Facebook page and on Twitter, our handle here at Francois F24. Let's begin with the pivotal question, one that we ask every day in newsrooms, of how we get our news. Now, we're blessed this week to have with us 4 esteemed representatives of that medium they call the printed press. Here in France, we've had quite a lot of bad news when it comes to print media in the past week. Tabloid François announcing it's dropping print and going exclusively online. A week of good news and bad news for Sylvie Kaufmann's publication. I'll begin with the bad news. Le Monde, the paper of record in this country, suffering its longest strike since 1947, printers walking off the job for 4 days. At the same time, Sylvie, you've just announced a partnership with U.S. Online media giant, the Huffington Post. Would you say that it's this transition period of finding one's feet in the digital age is moving?
Mm-hmm. Well, you have both sides of our job here, right? We have the old print plant and the strike, very traditional event, unfortunately. We are trying to restructure, the management of Le Monde is trying to restructure the print plant, and of course that involves some loss of jobs, and that's the old industrial story. So we had 4 days of strike, which, as you mentioned, was unheard of almost in the paper's history. And we're back on the streets, fortunately. But even when the paper was not coming out, we were still producing a paper which could be read on the web and on tablets and on smartphones. So it's not like in the old days when the paper was on strike, there was no content at all. There was no Le Monde anywhere. Now you can still read Le Monde. And so as at the same time, yes, there was an agreement signed with the Huffington Post. It's a partnership with one of our websites, not the website of Le Monde, not lemonde.fr, but Le Poste, which was a subsidiary, and the Le Poste will become Le Huffington Post. And it's a small team, but it will be an interesting experiment, yes.
Christopher Dickey, a online media news organization teaming up with a traditional print publication. Does that sound familiar to you?
It does sound vaguely familiar. The Daily Beast was created as a strictly online 24/7 news site, and it's been in existence for 3 years. It's got 10.5 million unique viewers a month. It's like 70 million page views. And it's a very successful enterprise. And Newsweek was struggling, not because of the news gathering business, but just because of the cost of producing a magazine. And the two have now combined, and we're doing pretty well, I have to say. But it's a difficult time because, 5-6 years ago, we were all talking about whether news gathering was going to be overcome by the web. Everybody, the buzzwords were that it was all going to be groups of people just reporting from here and yon, and you wouldn't even need reporters anymore. Well, we found out that wasn't true. Actually, people still come back to reporters, to professionals like us, thank goodness. But how we get paid is a problem that nobody has solved
What's
yet.
the adage? People have never read the newspaper as much as ever before, but it's just and paid so little for it.
Well, that's right. And it is that the whole problem is that nobody has really discovered the economic model that makes sense. And in a way, magazines may be in a better position than newspapers, because a magazine is a better advertising medium for certain kinds of things because of all those glossy color ads. But and also because what people expect from a magazine is different than what they expect from a newspaper, which tends to be very much like what they expect on the web.
And as Christopher knows, worse off than France and Europe is North America. A graph in this week's edition of The Economist tells the tale. Circulation worldwide dropped by 1.7% in 2010. The World Association of Newspapers and News Publishers says ad revenue dipped 3% in the past year, but 23% between 2006 and 2010. And there you see that drop for North America in circulation, which is quite huge. At the same time, you see that Asia and Pacific, the huge increase bolstered by places like India. Interesting to note that newspapers reach 2.3 billion people each day, 20% more readers than the internet. But Tunde Fatunde, that's perhaps changing. You're in a country that's the most populous on your continent, Nigeria, where people, but your big problem has always been, if you live in Lagos, you can get your hands on The Guardian each day. It's a lot more difficult if you're up country.
Precisely. The thing is that each time human beings create machines, the first victims are human beings themselves. You know, you remember when IBM created its first computer. The engineers that created the computers were the first to be fired, interestingly. So you get into a situation where progressively electronics media are in a situation where those in the big cities are the major beneficiaries, but those at the countryside are not, because of all kinds of absence of infrastructure in those countryside. So you get what I call an elite readership in the cities at the expense of those who live at the countryside.
Now, The Guardian, which is a great read, by the way, oftentimes you have a little bit of a problem with bandwidth. It's a bit slow sometimes to load the pages, especially when you get beyond the homepage on them. How far in the future would you say will be the time when Nigerians, even in the countryside, will be able to read your newspaper on the web or on a smartphone?
Well, this should be determined by the rate of expansion of the optic fibers. You know, the electronics media came into Nigeria through the VSAT, satellite kind of technology. Very expensive, very slow. But with the presence of optic fiber gradually being installed in West Africa, about 4 or 5 now, the idea of reading newspapers through the tablet or smartphone and so on, it's a novelty, but still in the big cities.
Still in the big cities, so not quite there yet. Should also mention that the week is concluding with finance ministers and central bankers converging on this town to prepare a G20 summit next month in Marseille, with everyone remembering how the week began with the Eurozone's sovereign debt crisis' first major bank failure and the breakup of the Franco-Belgian Luxembourg group Dexia. Now, on the outside looking in, David Cameron told the Financial Times that Europe needed to take a, quote, big bazooka approach to the crisis. Interesting. Christopher Dickey, who would you aim that big bazooka at?
Everybody. I mean, the problem with the bazooka as a metaphor is that it's targeted. And the problem with the crisis is that everybody is implicated. So I think you need a machine gun or maybe a weapon of mass destruction to take care of all the people who are implicated in this crisis, in the governments, in the banks, the populations themselves. People got used to the idea that growth could solve everything. And all of a sudden, when you didn't have growth, you found out that there were masses of problems that not only growth hadn't solved, but in some ways it made them much worse. Because like any situation where people are living beyond their means but continue to get credit, it gets worse and worse and worse. And this happened to nations, individuals, companies, banks, across the board.
Dana Harman, what's the street credibility of Europe? You know, in your country, we know that bashing Brussels is a pretty safe sport on this continent. But what's the general feeling about Europe?
You're right. It's not the main topic right now in Israel. on this issue when looking at Europe and when dealing with Europe, much more interested in the politics now of what's happening. But when they, I think, I just don't think that it's an enormous issue right now in Israel.
Just not at all, even though you had all those people who came out and protested in the streets, and that took a lot of people by surprise against poverty.
There is a knock-on effect in Israel from the European crisis, the global crisis.
Yes, and in fact, all those demonstrations were interesting, and they came after the same thing that was seen in Spain and in France a little bit, and so then that's true.
Now, the French finance minister, François Baroin, this Friday, saying that a complete and durable package is in the works. The French and the Germans, Sylvie, are going to pull a rabbit out of the hat soon before that G20 summit. Do you think we're going to have a happy ending?
We've certainly been waiting for this package for a long time, and it's quite slow to come. And I think you mentioned Prime Minister David Cameron's interview to the FT earlier, and there's a sense of urgency, definitely, but even of exasperation coming from our partners in Europe, not mentioning other partners in the world. You've heard President Obama and Tim Geithner getting, a bit cynically, I think, exasperated with Europe. Where did all this crisis come from at the beginning? Certainly from the other side of the Atlantic. But yes, Merkel and Merkozy, as some say, are at last working on it, and we hope that there's this.
But they're promising us big things here. If they don't deliver,
I don't know if it will be the bazooka.
No. I don't know where they're going to get all the money, to tell you the truth. If they've got hundreds and hundreds of billions of euros to throw around, where was it before?
Precisely.
You wonder if they're going to dig another hole, as a matter of fact, because what they really are trying to do is get back to that growth situation that we were talking before. But whether that will really solve problems, I don't know.
But I think there's no choice. There's when we're talking about this sense of urgency, they do feel it too. And of course, it's very hard politically. It's very difficult to put it together, this package, and it probably won't be enough this time, and there will have to be another package. But at the same time, we're reaching a moment now where we have to get it over with, and we have to find a solution. Otherwise, we just implode. And I think this is where we are now, and politicians do understand it now. Hopefully, we saw this with Slovakia, the vote in Slovakia. The first vote was. They rejected the strengthening of the.
Less than 24 hours later, they make them vote again.
Yeah, this is the way Europe works, and that's democracy, I guess.
And you mentioned the issue of you're going to have to spur growth. Should mention that even though Britain's jobless rate this week hit a 17-year high, David Cameron drawing heat for staying the course on austerity.
Mr. Speaker, the same script month after month is not working. Doesn't he realise today's figures show it isn't working? And it's his failure that means today in Britain we have nearly 1 million young people out of work.
But let me say this to him, because I know what he wants. He wants us to change course on reducing our deficit. If we change course on reducing our deficit, we'd end up with interest rates like Portugal, like Spain, like Italy, like Greece, and we'd send our economy into a tailspin.
Paul Krugman, the Nobel laureate economist, writing on his blog, British rates are low for the same reason U.S. rates are low, not as a reward for fiscal virtue, but because everyone now expects the economy to stay depressed and policy rates near zero for years to come. Sylvie Kaufmann mentioning a wake-up call, but you're really between a rock and a hard place, Christopher Dickey.
Well, sure you are, and I'm not an economist, but when you read people like Krugman, what they're saying is pump the money in, get people back to work, because unless you can get people back to work, all this austerity is for naught. You can't have a situation where you have masses of unemployed and the government has to support them, or then quit supporting them and you have social unrest and expect that you're going to have the growth that's needed. I think what a lot of people are complaining about, and I think this is part of the Occupy Wall Street movement in the United States, is this sense that the bankers get bailed out. the people who helped create this problem in the first place get bailed out, and the people who are working, who are just trying to get on with their own lives day to day, are getting screwed hour by hour, day to day, year by year. And they don't see any, as the cliche goes, light at the end of the tunnel. And that is creating a lot of anger. And I think we're going to see a lot of social unrest as a result. And all this talk about deficits, what's a deficit? I mean, if you're out of work, are you really worried about the percentage of GDP that the deficit represents? Are you worried what Standard & Poor is going to do? And by the way, who is Standard & Poor? The people who are giving AAA ratings to those junk bonds? No. I think there's just an awful lot of anger out there, and there should be. And I think that this idea that fiscal responsibility, the way it's being preached by Cameron, is going to solve lots of problems, is going to be a real tough sell to the people of Britain and, in fact, of Europe and the United States over time.
Very briefly before we go to the break, Sylvie Kaufmann, we're seeing that there are primaries to choose the opposition candidate in this country ahead of a presidential election scheduled for next spring. We see that the rhetoric is really taking a leftward tack, following up from what Christopher Dickey says. Will that continue to be the case, you think?
Well, yeah, it was the most interesting thing of the first round of the primaries at the Socialist Party was the score of the left-wing candidates. There were Arnaud Montebourg, who is advocating deglobalization, and he got 17% of the vote, which means that this strikes a chord among French voters on the not only left-wing and even social democrat side. So I think the two main contenders now are a little bit unsettled by this, because they don't want to speak about deglobalization, but at the same time they have to listen to these concerns. So it's going to be, yes, it will be an issue in the campaign, I think.
All right, puts
definitely.
the government in a tight spot, puts the opposition in a tight spot. When we come back, we'll be looking at some of the major issues of the week, including those 3 days when a lot of business people had to go cold turkey because their smartphones had crashed. Stay with us.